All right, in this unit, we're going to have a few videos about emotions, stress, and health. And I think by the end, you'll see how all these things are really tied together, particularly stress and health, as we've kind of already covered a little bit in our synchronous sessions on relationships and how we talked about social support in that unit. So let's start with emotions to kick this off. Um, to start, I just want to cycle through a few pictures and want you to think about the emotional reactions that you would associate with those pictures. Maybe you don't have full-blown emotional reactions, but you certainly have associations with these different pictures, probably that allude to some different emotions, and they probably elicit some sort of response or maybe even some kind of physiological reaction or behavioral intention in you. So just look at these pictures and just think about what you experience and what you might do in reaction to them. Okay, so for all those different pictures, you probably had a similar reaction that most other people watching this had. That seeing a crying baby might make you feel a little anxious, maybe a little sad or upset, and it might lead you to want to comfort that baby. Whereas seeing a baby with a different sort of behavior, where it looks happy, excited, that might make you happy and make you want to do something to relate to that baby and play and do something happy. Some of the other pictures, like seeing something that looks really gross, like the stuff that looked like it was microwaved in a big weird mixture, that might elicit some kind of like disgust response in you, and it might have a physiological reaction that you like even kind of feel a little nauseous or want to kind of turn your nose up or move away. And other pictures there might make you feel sad, might make you feel aroused, might make you feel in awe of some kind of natural beauty. So it doesn't really take much for us to have emotional reactions, even to just kind of simple stimuli that we know, is not really in front of us. Partly because the way we adapted to have these emotions, pictures in this sense didn't really exist. We were always responding to things that were really in front of us. So our modern world where we see things that aren't really there, our bodies and to a certain extent our minds are still kind of catching up with that concept. We cognitively know that that mountainside's not really in front of us, but your initial immediate reaction is to react as though it is right in front of you in a sense. So, what are those different reactions that you might have had or might, have thought about having? Those are, in some sense, emotions. And it turns out that emotions are a really complex thing to try to define. One prominent neuroscientist said about emotions, one of the most significant things ever said about emotions may be that everyone knows what it is until they're asked to define it. And I think that kind of gets to, honestly, a lot of things in psychology where we have some personal or colloquial experience with the concepts, but when you have to sit down and approach them scientifically, it gets a little bit more difficult. A useful definition for emotions that is a little more technical might be feeling states that involve a pattern of cognitive, physiological, and behavioral reactions to events. And I think a lot of times when we think about emotions, just in our everyday lives, we think about the feelings that come around. But emotions are not just feelings. They are related to different patterns of behavior, different patterns of thought, and they are useful in certain ways to get us to behave in a way that is useful and adaptive according to what we're seeing and experiencing in our environments. But where do we draw the line between what's an emotion and what's not, or what are different emotions? So researchers for decades at this point have been trying to kind of classify or categorize different discrete emotions. And if you look at different researchers, they will have a different classification when you get down to some of the more finer grained ones. But there's a lot of overlap when it comes to the more basic types of emotions that we might all sort of recognize, especially cross culturally. It's useful to think about what evolutionary theorists think about emotions, because a lot of our, these kind of base level behaviors and reactions have a lot to do with the environments that we adapted to tens of thousands of years ago, right? So there's a lot of overlap when they think about the emotions that are most that are primary, that are base, that are very essential emotions. And you'll notice ones in common with these particular people that had to list important ones. They all mentioned fear, they all mentioned anger, some kind of joy, something akin to disgust, interest or anticipation, surprise. There's some overlap with contempt, shame, sadness, and then distress, guilt, and acceptance might be ones where there's a little less convergence um, in their classifications. But those, 5 or 6 at the top certainly are ones that we recognize, and ones that all have a particular set of behaviors that would have helped us in our ancestral environment. So when I say that emotions are useful or adaptive, I mean something relatively specific. I mean that every emotional reaction, again, has a certain set of behaviors, a set of ways that we might approach or avoid something that are in reaction to specific things in our environment. So if you think back to the types of stimuli we would encounter, the types of dangers that we would encounter in our ancestral environment, emotional reactions might help us, quickly react to things in a way that would help us survive, or in other cases, help us pass on our genes through reproduction. So emotions that might help us protect ourselves from threats, from danger, from predators, emotions that might help us connect and relate to others and communicate with them, and emotions that might kind of bind our groups together and help us cooperate and survive longer would all be very useful things. And those are the emotions that we tend to see for the most part with the most agreement. So we have all these things, have all these emotional reactions, not, for some random reason or to, make life richer or more interesting or whatever. The physiological reactions that we have to different stimuli they feel the way they do because those feelings and the way those feelings lead to other behaviors helped us adaptively. They helped us survive. They helped us help people like us, and they helped us pass on our genes. So specifically, you might find these connections interesting. That anger, for example, is an emotion that usually includes some kind of expression of disdain. You show anger by a particular facial expression, and showing anger might protect you from some sort of encounter with someone who means you harm, because it might intimidate them and make them leave you alone. So anger is adaptive to keep your safety in that sense. Fear, if you are not somebody that can kind of back up that anger, fear might be another way to get out of a fight or get out of some kind of confrontation by showing submission and by, getting the stronger person or the stronger predator to kind of just leave you alone. Another really interesting one is disgust. And I think a lot of times we might not think about disgust as an emotion in our everyday lives, but it really very much is. It's a very fundamental emotion that, for the most part, seems to have been useful to help us avoid contamination or infection or sickness. So if you got nauseous from something that you ate that didn't agree with you, made you sick, that feeling of disgust that you would have from that, and that association you would have later on when seeing that same food or food like it, that's an emotional response that's going to help you avoid that later on. And being able to make faces and that very identifiable facial expression we have for disgust would help communicate that to other people. So the more you are able to get across that, these berries or this meat makes you sick or smells bad, that would communicate to people around you that they should avoid it too, and that would benefit your entire group to not eat it. Disgust also has to do with infectability and transmission of disease. It would help us avoid people that look like they were infected or had like telltale signs of different disease. That's why certain types of physical features might be disgusting to us sometimes because they might in the past have been associated with some sort of particular sort of illness. So disgust in a kind of currently unfortunate way kind of maps onto our social groups in some ways too, because we also tend to be disgusted a little bit more by groups that are less like us, because when you were less like a particular group, you would share fewer of the same antibodies, and you might be more likely to get sick from encountering people you hadn't met before. So those types of things that were adaptive in our ancestral environment now today might unfortunately in some ways feed into the types of negative reactions and prejudices that we have for people. So just another kind of mismatch with how our development evolutionarily might not always serve us particularly well in our modern world. So I've talked a little bit about facial expressions. Let's talk about that a bit before we wrap this video up. Facial expressions are a really important part of emotional reactions, but you'll see that the most important part of them is not necessarily about the experience of the emotion, but about the communication of the emotion. So, people's facial expressions, the way they're holding themselves, some of the first things we notice about people. And as I show you these particular facial expressions, there's probably not very much ambiguity about what they are feeling. You probably can look at all of these and perhaps get all of them correct as you're trying to determine, what emotion they're feeling. And this, kind of hokey picture showing people from different cultures is doing that because, this is how in textbooks you very commonly will show that facial expressions are relatively consistent across cultures. That these very fundamental 6 facial expressions that map more or less onto those emotions I showed you on those lists earlier are very consistent. You can go to any other country and culture and make that face on the top right, and people will know that you are disgusted by something. So these are not culturally variant. You go anywhere and you're going to recognize these things, and your emotions will also be recognized. If you were, wondering maybe what the middle ones were exactly, those may be slightly harder to recognize, but I bet you were right on track with these 6 here that you might have been trying to identify while I was talking. So again, there's probably some major adaptive evolutionary significance to this, that if we see things across all different cultures, then that tends to mean that it's something really fundamental about our behavior and about our ability to communicate. That this was a really important thing to be able to let people quickly and easily know how you were feeling, to keep each other safe, to let people know who's friend and who's foe, to try to let people help people cooperate, all of these things that would have been helpful in our ancestral environment. And another piece of evidence is that if these things develop really early in life and are even kind of separate from some of the things that help us notice them, then it's even more likely to be something that has kind of a biological sort of basis to it. So children express these basic 6 emotions between 6 months and a year. It's very early to see consistent behavior like that. But the real kicker is that this is true. These facial expressions come out even with children that were born without eyesight. So children that have never seen anyone make a disgusted face or make a happy face, when they are feeling those emotions, they still express them in that consistent way, which is a real strong indicator that these things, again, have some kind of biological basis. So these different expressions that we have for emotions are very similar across cultures, but I don't want to give the impression that emotion is all the same across different cultures. A big thing that varies across different cultures and regions tends to be how you display your emotions and when that is acceptable and for whom displaying different emotions is acceptable. So there are gender differences, for example, in how we, in most cultures, tend to display emotions. Men seem to be less likely to express their surprise and fear, and women seem to be less likely to express disgust, contempt, and anger. Now, anything that you're trying to draw into these gender differences based on evolutionary significance to some degree is going to be speculation. So these things are very hard to you know prove, certainly, like anything is, but it has been theorized that part of the reason we might see these gender differences is because men might have, in our ancestral environments, been more likely to have to, engage in conflict with other groups. So being less likely to be surprised or be afraid might have been something about physical dominance, and women were more involved in, keeping the group together, helping other people in the group. So showing emotions like disgust, contempt, or anger might have been less acceptable historically. Again, that is very much speculation, but it's speculation that lots of people have made at lots of different times. So it's a possibility. Um, Cultural differences are also pretty interesting here. That that kind of classic distinction between more individualistic and more collectivistic cultures. We see different emotional display rules that collectivistic cultures that are more deferential to the group identity is more important, group coherent or cohesion is more important. It's less appropriate to display negative emotions in public in those cultures because displaying negative emotions can kind of erode the uh, strength of a group, the cohesion of a group. So keeping those emotions more to yourself in those cultures is more the norm, even though people are probably feeling them to the same degree, but displaying them is not quite as common. So these facial expressions that we kind of feel like they're really tied into the emotion, and there's something that just happens when we feel the emotion. But it's also important to note that they aren't always expressed the same across different situations, even for the same people. So it seems like, based on this, they're more likely to be a tool for communication than they are a real automatic thing that's tied to the physiological experience of the emotion. So if facial expressions are just the reflection of what we're feeling, we might expect them to be automatic and consistent across different situations. But if they're more for communication, then we might expect to see them more pronounced or used more often when other people are around. And there's a really interesting study from a long time ago that kind of holds water and has been replicated too, where people looked at individuals across different social settings, and they noticed that people are more likely to display emotions when they're with other people. So they looked at people bowling alone versus bowling with people, at a hockey game alone versus at a hockey game with friends, and pedestrians by themselves or with somebody else. And they found that these people were more likely to smile at another person than they were to smile at themselves. And there were many other emotions they looked at here. The excitement from being successful after you bowl a strike, or when your team scores a goal, or when the other team scores against you. The types of displays that people engaged in this study were much more muted when they were by themselves, indicating that the communicative aspects of emotions is really tied to those facial expressions, and we do have some degree of control over the extent to which we show them outwardly. And this may be, kind of an automatic sort of process. We're not sitting there thinking like, oh, I'm alone, I'm going to smile weaker. It might just be something that we pick up on implicitly. We're around people. We need to emote and communicate and let people know how we're feeling.